time. So we're grateful that you're spending some of it with us, and we're going to do our very best to make it worthwhile. And I'm going to introduce Adam Tucker, who wears many hats at our school, but tonight he's the director of special events. So, Adam, you go.
Thank you, sir. Thank you guys for being here. We appreciate it. Glad the snow cleared away. Here we still have about 4 inches on the ground in my front yard in Thomasville. But thank you so much for being here. Just want to take a few minutes to thank our partners, the Middle Brothers Properties, AKR Builders, and also Holman Bibles, which is a division of B&H Publishing, which is a division of Lifeway. You have a few of their inserts in your bags. They make the Apologetics Study Bible. You can go to apologeticsbible.com if you're interested in learning more about them. Excellent Bible, and they were, of course, were out of those inserts for this particular event, but you have some inserts from some of their other works. You also have one of our little booklets that just explains in a nutshell our apologetic methodology and why we do what we do, the way we do it. If you haven't seen one of those, you have a brochure about us, info about some upcoming classes for the coming semester, which we'll talk more about in just a bit at the end of the night. I want to introduce our speakers for the evening and thank them for being here. First, we'll introduce Dr. Michael Ruse, who is not from Tallahassee, as you'll see soon. Had the pleasure of having lunch with him today, and it was a really good time. So thank you for that. Dr. Ruse is the Lucille T. Werkmeister Professor and Director of the History and Philosophy of Science program at Florida State University. Before coming to Florida State in 2000, Michael taught at the University of, I don't even know how to say that. Guelph. There you go, for 35 years. He received his BA from the University of Bristol in 1962, his MA from McMaster University in 1964, and his PhD from the University of Bristol in 1970. He's a fellow of both the Royal Society of Canada and the American Association of the Advancement of Science, a sometime Gifford lecturer. He holds honorary doctorates from the University of Bergen and McMaster University, the University of New Brunswick, and University College London. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently On Purpose, published by Princeton University Press.
Oh, is that all?
So let's welcome Dr. Ruse once more.
I feel I should mention at lunch that our speaker did not take lettuce on his hamburger. I just want your president to know.
Thank you. As you can tell, I always eat so healthy, so yes. Also want to introduce a good friend and mentor, Dr. Richard Howe. Richard G. Howe, I should say.
Don't want to leave the G.
Don't want to leave out the G. He's the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Apologetics here at Southern Evangelical Seminary. He earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Arkansas. He speaks and writes widely on philosophy and Christian apologetics. Dr. Howe is co-author with Dr. Norman Geisler, who is in the audience tonight, of The Religion of the Force, and he is a contributor to several books, including I Am Put Here for the Defense of the Gospel, Dr. Norman L. Geisler, a festschrift, easy for me to say, in his honor. The Jesus Quest, Danger from Within, the Popular Encyclopedia of Apologetics, and Reasons for Faith to Everyone an Answer. He's had articles published in the Christian Apologetics Journal, the Areopagus Journal, the Midwest Christian Outreach Journal, and the Christian Research Journal. He's spoken and or debated in churches and universities in the U.S. and Canada, as well as Europe and Africa, on issues relating to the defense of the Christian faith. In their free time, Richard and his wife Rebecca, who is also here this evening, enjoy international travel, and you can learn more about him at richardghowe, with an E.com. Let's welcome Dr. Howe. Our moderator for this evening is also an adjunct professor here at SES, where he's also an alumnus, Dr. Frank Turek. He's the founder and president of crossexamined.org. He's a dynamic speaker and award-winning author or co-author of 4 books, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Correct Not Politically Correct, and Legislating Morality. Dr. Turek speaks to numerous churches, high schools, and at secular college campuses every year. He's also debated several prominent atheists, including Christopher Hitchens and David Silverman. He hosts an hour-long TV program each week called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist that is broadcast Wednesday nights on DirecTV Channel 378 and NRB TV. His radio program called Cross-Examined with Frank Turek airs on 186 stations every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern and is available continuously on the Cross-Examined app. Please welcome Dr. Frank Turek. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Thank you again for being here. And Dr. Kirk, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Adam. Well, this is going to be a philosophical discussion on the issue of morality. So we're going to try and make this as obtuse as possible. Okay. So, no, we may go down. Our esteemed debaters here may go down into some deep philosophy. So just keep that in mind. And that's what we do here. We try and go as deep as possible, but still try and make it understandable to the average person like me. But we're going to have it's not going to be so much a debate, but a discussion. And this man is delightful, by the way. Of course, Richard is. I've known him for years. But Michael's delightful. I just had the opportunity to have dinner with him, and you're going to enjoy this discussion. So I'm just going to start by posing a question to Dr. Ruse here. It comes from his book, so I want to quote it because I don't want to get it wrong. In your book, Dr. Ruse, Atheism, what everyone needs to know, you say this: it is just that the objectivity of morality on this reading is an illusion put in place by our genes to keep us social, as much an illusion as the perfection of a boy or a girl with whom we have just fallen in love. It may all seem rather cynical on the part of nature, but whoever said that nature had to be upright and fair? This is a world of non-belief, and such are the consequences, unquote. Now the question is, what do you mean when you say that objective morality is just an illusion, if at the same time you also agree that torturing babies for fun is always wrong for everybody?
That's the trouble with writing books, isn't it? You leave a paper trail. Before I start, can I just acknowledge Dr. Geisler here? He and I are very old friends or very old enemies. We both appeared in the court case, the creationism court case in Arkansas in 1981. And I was reading the Wikipedia entry on him this afternoon, just to refresh my memory, and I discovered that our mutual friend, Duane T. Gish, author of Evolution, the Fossils Say No, 150,000 copies sold, said, I quote, Dr. Geisler had by far the best argument in the court case, end quote, or rather, but unfortunately the judge was biased, so his arguments were ignored, and the far less worthy arguments of the evolutionists were accepted, end quote. Well, that was certainly for me a very defining experience, and it has been a tremendously important experience in my life. Not that I became a creationist, but that I realized then that the whole issue of science and religion was not only an area which was there to be discovered or rather explored, but one which has certainly kept me going pretty much for the last 40 years, and here I am now. So I do want to thank you for being part of what was for me a very important experience. Thank you very much. Now let's pick up on what I said there. I think, I don't believe in the existence of God. I've been explaining this over supper. I'm not an atheist in the new atheist sense, as saying I know definitively that there is nothing. I believe very strongly with the geneticist J.B.S. Haldane that this world is not only stranger than we can think, but than we do think, but stranger than we can think. And quite honestly, I do think that existence is a mystery, and I think there's an awful lot of things, for instance, like quantum entanglement, where something happening on one side of the universe has an immediate response elsewhere, shows that at some level we're scratching at the surface. That said, I do not myself find myself drawn to the idea of some kind of benevolent being, whatever that might mean, who stands behind it all. And I feel very much in the spirit of David Hume that we humans, I'm an evolutionist, are animals. I don't think we're just animals. I think that we are, in many respects, very different from other animals through our intelligence and things of this nature. But I do think that we're just animals. And in other words, in order to understand human nature, we have to take, I would never say a materialist position, because I think materialism is just wrong, if it means just molecules in motion. As I said, if anything, I'm a panpsychist, believing that somehow intelligence or mind infiltrates everything. I don't quite know what that means, but that's what I believe in. So I'm not a materialist in that sense. I certainly am a naturalist. And so I want to try to understand how humans function. And maybe it's my Quaker background, or I don't know. But I don't think that we are Hobbesian, always fighting each other, social Darwinian in that sort of sense. In fact, I think the most important thing about humans is that we're social beings. And I think that that is both, well, it's certainly our great strength. And we've got adaptations which make us good for being social. I mean, I meet strangers today, and I'm not immediately, going around, shall I fight them? We sit down, we talk, we joke. And we've got other adaptations. The one, if I might use it in hallowed halls like this, is that women don't come into heat. And imagine if that were the case. I mean, my worthy opponent would be sitting there, and then suddenly he's thinking, oh my God, I've got to think about why I don't think ethics is an illusion. Oh my God, make way, I'm a full professor, I'm emeritus, I get first dibs. We're not. So we are very social animals with all sorts of adaptations put into place. And so I believe that morality, and I mean by morality not just feelings, but that sense of right and wrong, is a very important part of being a human being. So I do not want to deny what we philosophers call morality at the substantive level. You ought not to mark up your library books, and you should return them on time. But more important things, that parents have obligations to their children, and sexual harassment that we've been seeing in some of these TV producers is just simply morally wrong. It's not just a question, as the emotivist used to say, I don't like it, boo-hoo, don't do it, or something like that. I think that it's immorally wrong, and I think that's an adaptation, just like hands and teeth, which natural selection has put in place to make us good collaborators. In other words, to make us work. I mean, that's a very standard Darwinian position. I also think that if it didn't have some sort of backup, then we would start breaking it. I say to you, don't cheat, or don't cheat on this exam, and you say don't cheat, but then you're thinking all the time, well, what the hell, there's no reason why I shouldn't cheat, so it would all break down, unless we've got some enforcement. And I think the enforcement is this sense that morality is bigger than the both of us, bigger than the all of us. So, in other words, when I say to you, where's Adam? I don't like lettuce on my hamburger. I don't approve, and I'm sure his mother didn't approve. But, ultimately, I don't think you should go to hellfire. Well, I do, actually, but you know what I mean. I do think that that's more a matter of choice rather than something objectively wrong. But if Adam said, well, okay, you go out first, Mike, and then I'll slip out, and our waiters on the other side of the room, we can slip out without paying, I don't think that would just be a good lark to get away with. I think that would be objectively wrong. He ought not to do that, and I ought not to be part of his doing that. Now, the only way I think that we can, as it were, enforce that, so it doesn't break down, is some sort of sense that morality, as I say, is bigger than the both of us, that it is objective in some way. And so that's the position I take. Now, does that mean that morality has no referent? Well, because something's evolved, it doesn't mean that it has no referent. I see the train bearing down on me, and quite obviously, I better get out of the way. It's not good enough saying, oh, well, you only believe that because you've evolved, the adaptation of sight through evolution. So the train might not. Well, you try that, and you won't be around to argue the next, it's just a fact, it's just a theory, not a fact. Well, but I think morality is somewhat different. I think because my feeling is that we could quite as well, have a different morality, which would maybe function just as well. I like to call it the John Foster Dulles system of morality from the 1950s. He hated the Russians. He knew the Russians hated him. He knew he should hate the Russians because they were commie bastards. They knew that they should hate him because he was a capitalist, imperialist pig. But they got on okay together, though they didn't drop bombs, because they knew the other side. And so I think you could have a morality which would be quite different from ours, which would function. And I see no reason why we shouldn't have that rather than this one. So in other words, although we have the morality that we have, which works, I think we could have another morality which would lead to very different prescriptions about how we ought to behave, and which might just work just as well. So that makes me feel that there is no objective morality in the sense of God's will, or Platonic forms, or something, abstracts out there which is, we intuit in some way, because I just don't believe that. So, in other words, basically this is my position. I'm not against morality. I really do think that, you ought to help little old ladies across the road, and marking up the pages with yellow markers, the library books with yellow markers, is morally wrong. But on the other, unless they're my books, you're going to buy them and then I make sales. But I do feel that these things are morally wrong. But I ask myself, why are they morally wrong? And what I want to say is, this is psychology, not objective reality.
False. Okay, good. That's my response. No. Sorry, I stepped on you. No. I was going. Do you want to ask Dr. Ruse some questions? Well, want to make a statement, or
yes,
to what he said? Go.
Well, first of all, what I would like to see happen before the night's out is to help our audience understand a little bit more clearly how you distinguish materialism from naturalism. Because I think that's don't do it right this minute, but hopefully before the night's out, at least in the terms of how it's relevant to this question before us about morality, because I think that will help some of us understand a little bit more of the subtleties of your position as not just being the absolute equivalence to moral nihilism, let's say. Now, so that you guys will know, the organizers of this event worked out some questions for each of us that they gave us in advance so that we could have a sort of an idea of the things we're going to be. Now, Dr. Keurig may decide to ask some questions that are unscripted.
False.
Yeah. So maybe that'll add a little bit more incitement, at least on our part, because I didn't see that one coming, kind of thing. But anyway, so that you'll know. So if it looks like that somehow, it looks like this was written beforehand, that's why. Because I've taken some notes based upon what he's being asked, what I'm being asked, and also from having read this book, Atheism, What Everyone Needs to Think or Needs to Know, and then some other resources that Dr. Ruse was kind enough to make available to me as a PDF. So some of my comments here are going to be based on maybe some stuff that I thought about that were perhaps a little oblique from that first answer. For example, besides the materialism versus naturalism distinction, in your book you say on page 120 and then on page 167 that, first of all, morality is not something to be justified by science, which I think a moral realist and a Christian would agree with. But then you go on to say, but the reason why is because there is nothing there to be justified. So I'm a little curious, and I'll get some more stuff out on the table. I don't know how much back and forth you want right at this point, but I'm curious of how you can traffic in language like, I do think there is something objective there. I do think that there's a referent there. Do you think that there's a referent there that just is beyond the purview of the tools of science? So that's just in fact unjustified. Or do you think it's in principle unjustified by science because there's something about this reference? So that'd be something I hope that we come out. But another thing that worries me about the model, if you will, that evolution, unlike evolution, has given us hands and feet as adaptive tools, because at least we can see that hands and feet are real things in the world, that also evolution has caused us to have this feeling or psychology about morality, but it is itself not real. So in that case, evolution has caused us to believe something that's actually false about reality. I'm worried about what implications this would have about a broader concern of knowledge and epistemology. What else is it that evolution might have made us believe was the case when in fact it's not the case? So in other words, another 1,000,000 years from now, might we subjugate one race to another because that's actually what evolution has selected? I mean, who's to say, when you bring up the distinction between Sophie Scholl and Adolf Hitler, Sophie Scholl was part of the an anti-Nazi resistance movement. It's a college student who was beheaded at the age of 21 because she was found, and her brother and some others were found guilty of treason. It seems like there's something real about what she exemplifies versus what Hitler fails to exemplify in terms of moral virtue that we really resonate with, that's real. But if we're told that it's really just an illusion, I'm not sure then how you can traffic in the language of objectivity, because it's not. I can see why I have an objective hand by evolution, but I don't see why that I have an objective sense of morality when in fact that sense of morality is not real. And by the way, it's interesting to me, and I find the thesis very, very well put forth, not only in this, but in his contribution to the Cambridge Companion to Evolutionary Ethics, that all the while he's made the argument, well, evolution is more or less inculcated into this psychology that we falsely believe this idea of morality, but it's not really, it's really an illusion that somehow, though, Michael Ruse has escaped the shackles of evolution and is actually seeing the insight that what evolution is telling the rest of the human race is an illusion. I actually see that it's an illusion, but if everybody ends up seeing that it's an illusion, I'm not sure that we won't be those people that will behead each other because they didn't have lettuce on their hamburger.
Why don't you raise 3 questions for Dr. Ruse right here, Richard. It would be okay to at least start asking Dr. Ruse the question. Let's start with the third one that Dr. Howe just brought up. I'm rephrasing this, so tell me if I get this wrong.
Okay.
If evolution is a process whereby we come to believe in objective morality, even though objective morality is an illusion, how do we know it's an illusion? Because evolution would be giving us all our thoughts, not just thoughts about morality.
Well, I guess that's a good question. It's one that Alvin Plantinga is always raising. And I think the answer is that as an evolutionist, I'm something of a pragmatist in the philosophical sense, which means, to use, the philosophical terms, I'm more of a coherent theorist about truth than a correspondence theorist, in the sense that basically I think that truth ultimately is getting everything to hang together. And that we're what was it said? We're like being on a ship which is sinking, that we've got to repair. We can't get to land. And so we've got to, as it were, work on the planks that we've got at the moment, and we can sail very well. So I have to say, yeah, I suppose logically, an evil demon might be there. We might all be brains in a vat, and they're manipulating everything that we do, and there really isn't anything but interior picture shows. And at some logical point, I guess I'd have to say that's true. But at a realistic point, I say, well, here we are, and so we start with the basic facts, like, there are 3 of us up here, which seem to me perfectly adequate and perfectly true. And then we went to more difficult questions, like questions about to do with morality. Is there a difference between Adam doesn't like lettuce and Adam, feels that he should not, let's say, deceive little old ladies about crossing the road? In other words, he has a moral obligation to help little old ladies cross the road, but he does not have a moral obligation to eat lettuce, even though he's going to come out with pimples and all sorts of things for not eating his vegetables. You never thought you were going to get that one, did you? You wouldn't have taken me for lunch in a hurry, would you? So, as I say, I think these are more difficult things. So we work out, and we try to build as consistent a picture as we can. And if, for instance, we find at some point that what we really thought was true, in fact, dissolves in our hands, then we have to deal with it. I mean, I mentioned quantum entanglement, where something that happens one side of the universe affects something across the universe instantaneously. Well, Einstein told us nothing goes faster than the speed of light, so that couldn't happen. But now we know it does happen, so we have to pull back and rethink things at those sorts of levels. So that's what I mean by being a coherence theorist or a pragmatist. Now, as far as I'm concerned, things of everyday behavior like this are about as good as you get. Now, I realize that I'm going to be a minority of one in this room, but I would want to say the Earth goes round the sun, and that we evolved from ape-like beings. We didn't evolve from the monkeys that exist today, but I would say that's about as true as you can get. Now, so then I work from there, and I work on out to deal with issues like morality, and I'm led to say that I would worry if it led me to say raping little girls is okay. I would say this is so counterintuitive, I've got a feeling there must be a mistake somewhere back in the proof. But of course I'm not led to that. I'm led to be about as boringly conventional as you folks are. I mean, you know, I'm not saying all of us, every day, even Dr. Geisler, I bet, has returned a library book late at least once in his life. And he's been racked with guilt ever since. At least I hope he has. So the point is, I
put it under the blood of Jesus.
On something.
We put it under the blood of Jesus. It's okay.
Yeah. Fine. But obviously, there are going to be things we're going to differ about. Let's say about gays and, well, let's say about the morality of allowing women priests. But I don't think even there, or the morality of gays and lesbians, of giving them, you know, letting them marry. Even there, I often think these are not moral issues as such. We have the same morality. It's a question of how do you put the morality into action? How do you solve this? It would be bad to slice somebody up with a knife, but when a surgeon does it, it's a good thing. So you've always got to put these things in context. So, as I say, although I'm sure we do differ about a lot of moral prescriptions, I'd be very, very surprised if we didn't share the same basic moral values, like parents have obligations to their children.
Dr. Ruse, you bring up another point, and since this is a philosophical discussion, I want to go down.
Yeah, I thought we were going to talk about girls. I'm a little disappointed, you know.
We might get there. But you bring up the difference between the coherence view of truth and the correspondence view of truth. And I think that's important for our discussion here. So, Richard, do you see a difference between those two, and is one philosophically better than the other, and why?
Yeah, you know, I don't want this to deteriorate into some, you know, boring conversation about theories of truth, but I do think that the coherence theory of truth needs the correspondence theory of truth just to state what it is. In other words, if I said, well, the coherence theory of truth is you flip a coin, and if it's heads, it's true, and if it's tails, it's false. And then you would rightly go, oh, no, that's not what the coherence theory of truth is. The coherence theory of truth is, and he would tell me a definition that corresponds to what the coherence theory of truth is. So it's the correspondence between the name coherence theory of truth and the definition. It's the correspondence it's the correspondence between the two that we insist upon. So we can't not, I think, escape the obligations of the correspondence theory of truth, even if that straps us with uncomfortable duties. Not that you were doing this, but it straps us with uncomfortable duties of trying to find whether certain statements we're making do in fact correspond to reality. They get difficult to make beyond a certain point. I grant that, but I don't think that calls into question. By the way, even where you find, in my experience, the coherence theory of truth implemented, it's very selective. So it's like a Stephen Hawking is very candid about his, he doesn't use this expression, but he's candid about what in effect is a coherence theory of truth when it comes to various theories about the nature of time, in his brief history of time, for example. Yet I don't think he uses that same criterion when he goes and picks mushrooms for dinner. You know, that somehow all of a sudden it's not going to be some, well, as long as it coheres with the standard accepted model of quantum mechanical theory, then it's true, and if it doesn't, it's false. I think he's going to end up depending on a correspondence theory no matter what.
Any response to that?
Well, I would want to say that my position is one that Hilary Putnam pushed one time, although he gave it up, and he gave up just about everything he had every 5 years. But some kind of inner correspondence. In other words, the analogy I like is between cricket and baseball. Now, in cricket, you have, they call it an innings as opposed to an inning in baseball. But in cricket, you have 12 batsmen, and you go through them in succession, and you're not allowed to throw the ball, you must bowl the ball. Whereas in baseball, as you know, you have 3 people come up first half of the inning, and then 3 more from the other side. But those first 3 people are going to come back later in the game. Whereas in cricket, unless you've got 2 innings, it's a long game. In cricket, they're not going to come back. And as I say, in baseball, you throw the ball rather than bowl the ball. Now, within baseball, I think it's perfectly right to say something like this. If somebody says, oh, next batsman coming up, and the umpire says, no, you've already had 3 at-bats, and they're all out now, that's it. We have to move on. That, I take it, is a perfectly objective statement. It's not something, let's debate that now. Let's sit and talk about whether there should be a 4th batsman. No, those are the rules within this. And in cricket, after you've had 3, well, bring on the 4th, bring on the 5th, bring on the 6th. Oh, you're throwing the ball, you're not allowed to do it. Well, let's have a debate about that. Why shouldn't I be allowed to throw the ball? Because those are the rules. Now, what I want to say is, within the system, you're not working pragmatism or whatever, you're working correspondence. What is the objective fact about whether or not you're allowed to have more than 3 batsmen in an innings, or an inning? And as I say, within baseball, you're not allowed to. Whereas within cricket, you are allowed to. So, as I say, I think they're objective, but obviously, in the greater scheme of things, I don't think saying there's only 3 batsmen allowed in an inning is something which corresponds to objective reality in the whatever it is. And so basically, this is the position I take on something like, well, knowledge generally, but ethics in particular. Within our system, certain things correspond to right and wrong within the thing. And I know perfectly well what I mean when I say, yes, that's right. Or, as I might say, well, I'm not quite sure, but let's take a pragmatic approach. We've got to do something. So let's go with this one rather. I can use those without some perfectly good correspondence talk within it. But I'm not saying that it, as it were, corresponds to some absolute Kantian thing in itself, Ding an sich beyond. I don't know.
Richard, what is the problem with pragmatism? Why not just...
It just doesn't work.
It doesn't work. Okay.
Why it's the only thing that works.
That's it.
Why don't we just say we know what makes human beings flourish, as someone like Sam Harris would say, and we just pragmatically decide that these things will help human beings flourish and these things won't. Why do we need a standard outside of human beings if pragmatism can get us where we need to go from a moral perspective?
I think there are 2 things that are being muddled here. One, I don't dispute the point of your illustration of the sports. That is to say, obviously we can recognize when something is stipulated like a game, then we can judge whether some action is or isn't consistent within that game and corresponds to the rules of the game. But you go on to say, but in the grander scheme, we see that what's going on at the game may not go on at the level. But my position is not so much a dispute of, gee, let me see if I could give you some good reasons why you ought to be a correspondence theory of truth, which in effect would be me giving a pragmatic argument for a correspondent. I'm thinking of a stronger claim in that correspondence is something we never really ultimately ever fail to do. It's like the law of non-contradiction. I wouldn't argue for the propriety and prudence of non-correspondence as a logical law. I would say it never fails to obtain at some level. So even if we can have isolated pockets where coherence reigns, perhaps in some of the outer edges and thresholds of quantum theory, like the Hawking example, or in stipulative things like sports, I'm not disputing that. Well, sure, I can understand the superiority of a pragmatic approach, and even practical questions like in politics, for example. I think people sometimes see the difference between a principled approach and a pragmatic approach. So suppose we were talking about minimum wage laws. We would probably listen with patience to someone who could say, I can give you an argument to show, whether they can or can't show this, I'm just illustration. I can give you an argument to show that, in fact, minimum wage laws actually hurt the very people they're intended. That would be But suppose someone said, well, I can give you an argument that if one race subjugates another race into involuntary servitude called slavery, that actually will help the economy. I think people would just go, well, no, it doesn't matter whether it would work. It doesn't matter whether you could show, well, gee, if the Nazis had won the Second World War, and you actually did eradicate a certain segment of the human race, we actually all would be better off, except for that one segment. I think people would just go, well, something is wrong. It's gotten oblique from something that's real, not just merely something that's pragmatic. Now, what I would like to also throw out, so maybe we can visit this as we go along, is that I think that somehow I'm strapped with the obligation of, at least in principle, trying to show that what I think is actually true about ultimate reality and what I think is actually practical in terms of human flourishing about reality actually marry, actually come together at some point. I think unless and until the Christian does that we haven't pushed the argument all the way over the finish line when it comes to this specific thing about morality.
Well, one of the things I failed to do was to give you an opportunity to give a 2 or 3 minute, 4 minute, 5 minute overview of your position. We heard from Dr. Ruse, and by the way, I forgot to also mention that about 8:30 or so.
Bring up the question of materialism versus naturalism.
Well, I'm going to get there,
Okay,
yes, sir.
fine. Okay.
But you're going to ask questions if you like about 8:30 or so. So write down your questions now if you have questions from the audience. So, Richard, why don't you just do a short overview of what you believe is the grounding for morality, and then we'll continue with these other issues that you brought up earlier.
Well, one of the things I was wanting to make sure that I said tonight, because the question before us is, can there be good without God? And I would answer the question, no. There cannot be good without God. Now, how it is that I would make that argument is what hopefully we'll begin to explore before the night's out. I can guarantee you we won't exhaust the topic. But I don't want anything else I say for the rest of the night, no matter how obtuse and just, esoteric it may sound, to detract from my definitive, hopefully clear declaration that I personally believe you cannot have good without God. But notice even the discussion as it's gone so far. The question before us tonight is, can there be good without God? Notice the difference between that question than how, at least in my experience, how a question is framed that at least in my experience, most often I encounter is the question, can there be objective morality without God? And I hear that question asked more often in Christian and non-Christian debates over morality than the way it was worded tonight. Can there be good without God? And so what's the difference? Well, one of the differences is that our question before us tonight is asking a question about good. And I would submit to you, and maybe we'll again have time to explore the details, that there is a difference between good and moral good. So moral good, I would argue, is a subset of good. And one of the, I think, problems that Christians, you could just, for the rest of the evening, you can add the qualifier, in my experience. That is just what I've been hearing as an apologist over the past few decades, is that Christians rush to address the question of morality without subsequently dealing with the issue of good. And I think it muddles the discussion at some point, the nuances about, well, what is good versus the subset moral good? Because that hasn't been clarified, I think eventually the questions about morality sort of bog down into almost a dead end, at least in my experience. So that's one difference, is the difference between morality specifically and then the broader category of good. The other is this idea of objectivity. Now, this was actually one of the questions that you guys had posed for me tonight, so you can cut me off if you don't want me to jump ahead to that question, but you raised for me the specter of objectivity, because I have been heard to say in public before that I don't think it's so much the objectivity of morality that ought to be in question. I mean, there's a sense in which asking whether morality is objective is like asking, is gravity objective? Now, if you ask me, could there be gravity without God? In fact, I think if you ask most Christians this, they're going to say, well, no, you can't have gravity without God. He's the creator. But for some reason, that little connection between you couldn't have gravity without God because you couldn't have anything without God, I think there's an important sense in which the same answer applies to the question about morality. You can't have morality without God because you couldn't have anything without God. Now, why that's the case, for me, is a little bit more than just merely, well, he's the creator, and so it would be nothing but him. But we can explore that if you want. So it's not so much the objectivity, although I appreciate that question. I appreciate what it's trying to get to. I just go, before we start talking about its objectivity, well, why don't we talk about what it is first in terms of its nature, what is morality when we talk about it? How does that connect with what we might want to say is good? What's going on here? And then to me, that begins to sort of set everything in place so that the discussion about its objectivity makes more sense. It's much more robust. So to put a direct answer to your question, my model historically is known as natural law theory. And so natural law is our heritage as Americans. It's part of our birth certificate in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, the Founding Fathers, even though it was a little slightly different version than Thomas Aquinas' version that I hold, it nevertheless is residual from Aquinas. And it's in the phrase in the Declaration of Independence, when the colonists were trying to justify their right to rebel against King George, they said what entitles them to this were the laws of nature and nature's God. And their laws of nature wasn't merely gravity, electromagnetism, it may include that, but it was the moral law, which was something real that entitled them to be able to make this rebellion. Now, whether they were actually justified, we can have that conversation. Some natural law theorists might think they still didn't meet the threshold of justifiability. But it's the same thing that Martin Luther King Jr. appealed to in his letters from Birmingham jail, to justify their right for civil disobedience because the way blacks were being treated in the United States was just wrong no matter what the law said. That was his argument. It's the same argument that at least implicitly, that the Nuremberg trials made by appealing to something that was greater than the laws of the Soviet Union or France or the UK or the United States, who were the justices of the trials.
Richard, let me interrupt for just a second, because I think Dr. Ruse would agree, I think you already did agree, correct me if I'm wrong, that you agree there's something beyond us. The question is, what is it? It seems to me, and I've heard you say this before, Richard, I think you're both doing the same thing. We both have this sense of objective. We all have this sense of objective morality. Now what we're trying to do is reverse engineer why we have that sense. And is it just a sense, or is there some real referent out there that has given us this? What would that referent be?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And pretty obviously, for somebody like my opponent or my fellow debater, is it would be either God or some kind of transcendent world of rationality like Plato's forms or something like that. Or, as I said, I'm sufficiently agnostic on that I don't want to have to rely on that in my analysis of what is good. I want to say I believe in good, but I sure as hell don't know why I believe in good or why something's good. Let me pick up on a couple of points that he made as we went along, is that, first of all, has Adam disappeared in embarrassment? Oh, there he is. When we were at lunch today, we were listening to some god-awful music in the dive. He said, I'm not normally allowed on the credit card of the college to go for spare ribs, but since you're with me and a non-believer, I can. I won't tell you how much he ate, but there was no lettuce. But anyhow, we were listening to awful stuff on the thing. We're supposed to, let's say, a Haydn quartet. I would want to say the Haydn quartet has some kind of what I would call objective goodness that the music did not have. Although I recognize that questions of taste. I mean, I love opera, whereas other people love jazz, and I'm not so chauvinistic to say that makes mine's good and yours is not, because I appreciate the people who really take jazz seriously. So I do think there's another sense of, or there's a broader sense of good, although I'm not sure I want to distinguish the two entirely, because it seems to me that somebody who appreciates the good aesthetically is probably somebody who takes morality seriously, although that's debatable. I mean, obviously Wagner appreciated the good aesthetically, but whether he appreciated the good morally, I think is another matter entirely. So, as I say, I think we've got probably a lot in common there. We might differ about it, but I think we'd be on the same playing field there. I just have to come back. I agree with you. When I use the word morality, I am talking about objectivity. Killing little babies for fun is morally wrong in a way that Adam's not eating lettuce today may have been foolish, but it wasn't morally wrong for him not to eat lettuce today, although I can see his president's taking note, and I wouldn't want to be Adam at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning when he sees the president would like to talk to you. And he goes in there, and he sees 5 lettuces right there. And he says, if you haven't eaten all of these by 9:30, you're fired. But anyhow, so as I say, I do see that. It's a question of where we go from there. Obviously, I want to talk about morality being objectively good. Just like I want to say, objectively, there are 3 outs in baseball, and that's the end of that half inning. I mean, that inning, that's all there is to it. It's an objective truth. It's not something for debate. So I certainly use there. The final thing I want to say, picking up on this and following from this, is the whole question of natural law. In many respects, I'm absolutely and completely a natural law theorist, because I take natural law to say morality is not the arbitrary wish of God. And if God wanted to make it okay to hit little old ladies on the heads on Fridays, God could have done that. I mean, maybe the God of Job might have done that, but I don't think the God of the New Testament would have done that. And so, as I say, I think morality is very much bound up with the sorts of people we are. So I think it's morally wrong to ignore children, and particularly not to take special care of your own children. And I think that is part of natural law. It's not an arbitrary decision by God that parents should love and cherish their children. It's the way that God, if you like, has made us. It makes it so that this is right. And I'm perfectly happy with saying all of those things. The other thing is, I personally don't want to put God behind it. I want to say it happened through evolution, through natural selection, and that, for me, is the end of it. If somebody now comes along and says, well, I agree with all of that, maybe a Christian evolutionist, but says, I don't think it was just chance, I think that this was part of God's plan, I'm not going to argue with them about that. I might argue about the God thing. But we're no longer arguing about the morality issue here. We're arguing about, I think, something different.
Richard, is there a problem with saying that evolution can give us objective morality?
Well, let me segue into that. All right. Just a couple of observations, just for the record here.
Assuming evolution is true.
Because I think one thing that needs some clarification in my mind is the difference between something being objective and something being real. Mm-hmm. So apparently something unreal or an illusion can be objective. So I'm not really clear on how that's the case. Second, just so you a little transparency, I noticed in your book and again tonight that it's like a false dilemma when you were speculating about what you thought my position was. You said it probably has something to do with God in some sense or some kind of anomalous thing. And I think
Plato.
Plato, or in effect, Plato or Oz. Exactly. So, and I just want to go on the record to say, well, I'm neither of those. So I probably agree with you that it isn't, morality isn't explicated ultimately in these categories of Plato, nor are they ultimately, whatever that means, nor are they ultimately explicated in the categories of Occam. But that's a false dilemma, and it's something that Thomists generally regret in the contemporary conversation. That typically the choice is, if you think there's something real about it in some kind of metaphysical way, then you're some form of Platonism. And if you don't, like a person the objector might say he is, then you're in effect some form of nominalism in a sense. It's not really picking out anything real in reality. The middle ground there is Aristotle, and he almost never gets a hearing, and by implication, Thomas Aquinas. So, just for the record, that would be my view, that I would agree that, it isn't some kind of crude divine command theory that's lurking in my views, that I somehow think that it's wrong for people to treat old ladies a certain way because God said it is, but if tomorrow he said it wasn't wrong, then it wouldn't be wrong. which a sort of crude form of divine command theory would obligate someone to admit. But we just might go on to qualify. So I don't think he really would do that or whatever. I go, that's not Aquinas' view, that's not my view. That there's something else that's real, that's a part of this whole discussion that I think doesn't get discussed enough philosophically in the circles in which my ear is trained, and that is the concept of being, the concept of existence. That's why when you ask a Thomist, well, do you believe there could be X without God, morality or anything else? It's like asking, do you think anything would exist if there just wasn't existence? You just go, well, no, there couldn't be anything existing if just there wasn't existence. So the Thomist is going to try to, and especially this comes key in this discussion about morality, the Thomist is going to try to say, you have to somewhere hook up, and this is another question you pitched out to me, so we can come back to it, because I'm talking too long, and that is the specter of the is-all fallacy, or the naturalistic fallacy. And it's just not a fallacy. I think it's a specter. It's just a chimera, in a sense. So, hooking it up with being. Now, back to your question. Do I think evolution can, how did you say it, can give me objective morality? Right. You could give something objective morality accidentally. That is to say, it's entirely logical to think that through some kind of process of evolution, someone may just, in fact, develop some psychology that forbids them from lying or stealing or murder. But the question to me is not so much whether that, and if you want to call that objective morality, fine, but I don't think it really is morality. Because it's not ever ultimately picking out anything real. If it doesn't pick out something real, then why are we discussing it? What interest would I have as to whether or not what I choose to celebrate, by the way, if I may interrupt myself, when you observe in your book that this is how morality, this is something, I'm going back to something I said earlier, that morality is something that evolution has more or less caused us to think is true, but is not really true, it's just an illusion because it leads to the survival of species, but it didn't lead you to think that it's real. But yet somehow there's something in you that keeps you from just going, well, but why shouldn't I lie? I mean, is my lying somehow going to just thwart the evolution of the human race? Well, maybe that would be a good thing, to thwart the evolution of the human race. So what I think is lurking under all of these kind of discussions is some kind of sense. Now, I don't be unfair and impose this on you, but I think there's some kind of sense in most people I talk to that when we talk about right and wrong, we're talking about something real in a similar way when we talk about something being tall or short or big or little or sweet or sour, that we're picking out something real. That's what I think we really do. Now, if somebody wants to say, yeah, you do that, but you only do that because evolution's made you do that. Well, if that's the game, then maybe maybe I'm living in the Matrix or the Truman Show or whatever. And so all of a sudden it seems to render most of these kind of questions moot in a sense. And I'm not sure why a philosopher who figured that out would even want to tell anybody. Sort of like Feuerbach, well, we all do better if we all believe in a God, but we all know there isn't. You want to go, well, Feuerbach, why are you telling anybody? If you think everybody would be better off believing it, why are you writing a book to tell anybody there isn't a God? So why are you writing a book to tell us, well, it's really an illusion, but evolution wants us to think it's real? Well, now I'm not thinking it's real, because you just wrote in your book that it's not real.
I always feel it's a bit unfair when people bring my books along. I like to say I write the books, I never read them. As my wife says, you're not kidding. I guess, ultimately, the thing is, I agree with 99% of what you say, and then suddenly you draw a conclusion which is diametrically opposed to mine. I mean, the whole thing is, my whole position is that, as far as I'm concerned, real means we have 3 males up here rather than 3 females, or 3 humans up here rather than 3 donkeys. Well, maybe you think we've got 3 donkeys, but, well, 2 donkeys and me. But anyhow, so at one level, of course I want to say morality is real. That's the whole point of what I want to say. Morality is real. But I think what we philosophers call persuasive definitions You're trying to force on me a sense of reality which I've already assumed. You want to force on me some sort of real in every possible world could never, metaphysical sense of real, which is one that I'm not prepared to accept. Now, I recognize, of course you accept that kind of metaphysical sense of reality because you think that God exists absolutely and completely. And from this all stems, and as a good Cartesian, in this sense at least, you think that ultimately God would not deceive us, whether it's through...
See, I just broke out in a rash. As soon as I said I just broke out in a rash because I wouldn't be Cartesian about it at all.
Well...
It's not Cartesian.
All right, Buster. Now, those are fighting words. No, seriously, you believe that God exists, and you surely believe that at some level, God is not a deceiver. He's not...
Yeah, but what I mean when I say I'm not Cartesian, that's not a way... That's not the way I think the argument ought to be framed. So I think Descartes is the beginning of the problem. Pardon me?
Why are you putting it that way?
Well, I didn't mean to if I did, so I'll retract it if it sounded like that's what I was doing.
Did you get the cart before the horse?
I did. I might have gotten the cart before the horse. So, because I would, as a Thomist, I mean, this is Aristotle, and even more so Aquinas, that our experience of the physical world is more certain than anything. And it's from our experience of sensible objects that all human knowledge derives, ultimately. So God isn't some ad hoc to make the argument work as it is in Descartes. To me, the very fact that Descartes sets up as a methodology, his sort of methodological skepticism, is already to give up the game. He's already lost the philosophical game, in my judgment. Because to me, in effect, what that will do is it sets the seeds, the inevitable evolution, if you will, of some kind of bankrupt idealism. And Etienne Gilson said something very interesting when he said that history is the laboratory of the philosopher. And I think just tracking Descartes' philosophy all the way up to Kant, let's say, it is proof in the laboratory of the bankruptcy of the direction that modern philosophy is taken.
Well, goodness gracious me. I don't know what you're going to do when you wake up tomorrow morning and realize that this whole debate was a dream. You're still going to say Descartes was wrong. You bad,
yeah, well,
bad.
what that does is commit what I would call the fallacy of lost contrast. Because then all of a sudden the word dream just becomes the same word that I would use for reality.
Yes.
So it begins to have a lost contrast because the word dream doesn't really contrast with anything that's not a dream. Therefore, I just use the word real for what he's ultimately calling
well, this is
a
the
dream.
problem, Richard, is how are we using this word real? Obviously, this is the punchline, because we both want to use the word real. We're both, I take it, perfectly happy with the fact that saying it is really true that there are 3 males in front of the audience rather than 3 females, right? I think we're perfectly happy in saying that. So, in everyday discourse, we're perfectly happy with saying that. We're perfectly happy with saying, let's say, parents have obligations to their children, and that these are not just lettuce-eating, desires, or not eating desires. Adam, are you still there? My God, he's going to be careful what he eats the next time. But so we're both perfectly happy with saying it is really true that parents have obligations, special obligations to their children. Doesn't mean to say you don't have obligations to other children. Well, I think you and I would both agree that if you've got kids, you've got obligations to them, right?
Absolutely.
Let me bring Adam in a good way, because we were talking over lunch about having children, and he's got 3 small children, and we were talking about how strange it is and how stressful it is. But there was never any question in what Adam said that he felt deeply that this was something which was a real obligation laid upon him, if you want to use that sort of language. He and his wife are not raising these kids, just out of convention or because his boss would give him the sack. First of all, you've got to eat 5 lettuces, and then you've got to raise 3 children before 10 o'clock. No, I mean, this is something which is real. So we're both perfectly happy with using that kind of language. But now, it seems to me, you want to push it beyond there to say, yes, but you can't use the word real unless you're referring to some, if you like, you say Kant's, is an illusory philosophy or a barren philosophy, but unless it refers to some Diggersic thing in itself, Platonic forms, eternal truths in some sort of way, God in the Augustinian sense of the Confessions, something like that. And that's where I draw the line.
Yeah, but not quite, though. I mean, go ahead, Mr.
No, I was going to say, why do you draw the line there, Dr. Ruse?
Well, because I don't believe in those things, and I don't see any reason to believe in them.
Could this be, or is...
I mean, of course, this goes back, obviously, ultimately, I felt that Richard wasn't quite prepared to bring in the God question as quickly as I would, but I would want to say, first of all, as an ex-Quaker, I don't have much time for natural theology. For me, it's all a question of faith. And I just don't have that. I just don't have that experience. And so for me, as I say, I'm an agnostic. I have no, but it doesn't mean to say I'm going to say, I'm an agnostic, I can't talk about morality until I solve that one. I go on using the word real perfectly okay, because for me, reality does not refer to something in some transcendent way beyond us. And I think you're insisting that real cannot be used except in that sense, ultimately.
Well, not quite, because, see where to start here. It's not, I would argue that morality, I think the causal arrows go in the wrong direction. It's not that I think all these cosmic truths are true, and then I try to figure out how to leverage those out of the fodder that we have before us in which to frame the discussion, like sensible reality. It's the other way around. That I start with, as a Thomist, what I see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, not unlike Aristotle. And then it's like the difference between an engineer and a reverse engineer. I mean, an engineer is strapped with a problem. And so he or she tries to figure out the resources available and the methods available to solve the problem, build a bridge across a chasm, let's say. The Aristotelian Thomist is like a reverse engineer. He doesn't start with the problem, he starts with the solution. He doesn't do philosophy in order to discover whether he knows something. He already knows he knows things, but as a human being. He doesn't do philosophy in order to see whether there are things that are good and evil. He already knows that as a human. If he does philosophy at all, it's only just to reverse engineer, well, what would have to be true of reality to account for what I already knew to be true before I even started doing it?
But what is the solution that you're starting with? What is your solution that you're starting with?
The solution in this context that I'm starting with is that I think I already know that there are rights and wrongs morally. Kind of not unlike that you think you already know that. But I feel like the obligation as a philosopher is to say, at least try to say, is there a way to account for what I already at least think is true about reality? Now maybe I'll be disabused of that. Like I might have already thought certain things about fairies or unicorns as a child, and then something disabuses me that as I go on. That can happen too. But these cosmic questions, I think, that are universal human experiences like morality, because we find that morality is the same, very similar in all the world's religions and all the world's philosophies.
So you see, I've got the feeling you're smuggling in an assumption that I don't have. I don't mean this in a dishonest way. I just mean that you're now inadequate philosophically arguing, of course. But what I do want to say is this, because we both start with the solution that morality is real, that morality is objective, that parents have special obligations towards their children. I mean, I take it that both of you and I, if anything is real to us, that is real. Okay? So now the question is, if you were to go after me and say, well, I think that your evolutionary biology is wrong, that in fact I think you're relying on an inadequate theory, and that Darwinism doesn't prove this. Maybe that Darwinism, as Thomas Henry Huxley thought, Darwinism proves that we are lions and tigers, and the only way that we can be moral is by overcoming our evolutionary things. Then we're on the same playing field, and we can argue that one. But what's worrying me is that you and I, somewhere along the line, are not on the same playing field, because we both start with the fact that morality right and wrong. We both agree, you're a Thomist, I'm an evolutionist, that morality isn't arbitrary, that it's very much a function of human nature, that I take it as a good Thomist, you would want to say something like this,
Absolutely.
that it is natural for parents to love their children and to cherish them, and what is natural is that which is good in some sense. We're both on the same, arguing the same way there. Now,
Yeah, we might quarrel about what
where do we
it
go
is to
from
be
there?
natural.
And I think you want to say, for me, the solution to why all of this works is God. And I want to say...
No, that's not what I was saying.
Well, I feel it's what you should be saying.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
I hope you're taking notes on this. There'll be a big barrier that he doesn't have parking rights tomorrow, okay?
I would say that ultimately, but the problem is the ultimacy of it doesn't really make sense until the proximate part is unpacked, and that's what I think gets overlooked in the conversations, at least in
But
my
where's
experience.
my proximate cause going wrong?
Because here's where I think it's going wrong.
Evolution?
Help me understand how something could be real and be an illusion. If you said it's real that there are 3 males up here, and I said, no, that's just an illusion, wouldn't you quarrel with that? You wouldn't allow me to go, well, I'll grant to you that it could be illusion, but still real that there are 3 of us. I go, well, I'm not sure I understand how the terms are being used.
I think that if I were talking to a Yankees fan, that they would have such an emotional commitment, or a Red Sox fan, so much of an emotional commitment to their team and the way it's played, that they would say that this is, in some sense, the best possible game that one could have. And I'm glad of this because I'm supporting one of the best possible teams. And at that sort of level, I would want to say that is illusory, just as much as if, for instance, England said, well, having beaten the hell out of Pakistan as we just did, no question that cricket, English say this, that cricket is far superior to baseball and that sort of thing. And I would say, at some level, illusion is coming into this. Within the game of baseball, you've got truth, you've got objective truth, 3 innings or 3 bats and you're out and that sort of thing. But at some ultimate metaphysical level, I think that the commitment of let's say the English, let's not run down Americans, but on both, but let's not run down Americans. Let's say the English who say, as I grew up with, well, of course, Americans play baseball, that shows you why they're inferior. That's an illusion. That's what I mean by illusion. To believe that there's some ultimate, objective truth of your kind, a thing in itself, a platonic form, a transcendent God, that's the only way that you can get objective morality, I want to say, is illusory.
Well, let me summarize my view and tell me where you think I'm oblique to your objections, if I can do an end run around it. Because I think what has to happen, and you can press me on this, because you tried to already, but we didn't get a chance to chase it down. But I do think that there is something self-evident about being. That's the first thing we encounter in sensible experience is the existence of things. And we define the word illusion in terms of something is illusory in the sense in which it fails to obtain in being somehow. All right? Whatever else we can say about that. So I think that what makes something moral is the fact that I understand good, because I didn't get a chance to say this earlier, Mr. Moderator, so if you'll allow me.
Because you were talking about the founding fathers.
I was talking about the Nuremberg trial.
Yeah.
So what I think it means to be good has to be understood in a teleological sense. That a good X is an X that exemplifies or manifests the attributes or qualities or whatever that an X ought to have by virtue of being an X. So you say, well, that's a good knife that you have. And you say, well, why do you think it's such a good knife? Well, it's got such a sharp blade. It wouldn't make sense for somebody to go, well, who are you to say that a knife ought to have a sharp blade? Just go, that's just what it is to be a knife. So we use the word good pizza, good food, good hamburger, good lettuce. In every sense we mean, it is the kind of thing that it ought to be by virtue. It's exemplifying the kind of attributes it ought to have by virtue of being the kind of thing that it is. So the expression human nature has been thrown around. And I would press to say human nature is something real. There is something there. This is exactly what the Nuremberg trials picked out. Because when they couldn't try them on the basis of the laws of Germany or the Soviet Union, France, UK, or US, they tried them on the basis of crimes against humanity. You have to ask yourself, well, what's a humanity? Is it male or female? Is it tall or short, sick or well, black or white? What is a humanity? You either think it's real or it's not, in some sense of the term real. If you think it's not real in any sense, if you're anomalous, how can you commit a crime against it? I would submit to you, if you think it's picking out something real, then you're either going to be some version of the thinking of Plato or some version of the thinking of Aristotle in terms of Western. I mean, there are side roads and things. So what I think makes something moral is when you have a creature that acts, human beings, which I think are uniquely moral among sensible creatures on earth, have at least two things about us that distinguish us from just mere animals. And that is rationality, the fact that we can deliberate and make choices at a certain level, and free will. And not in the Arminian Calvinist sense of the debate about free will, which is a theological debate. I'm talking philosophical sense in which you can make choices that don't follow necessarily from pre-existing conditions beyond the will. That's what makes something moral, because unique among creatures on earth, I think, human beings have the capacity to choose actions that either contribute to or detract from what it is to be a human, to be a good human. Now, we can have conversations about, well, who are you to say that's what a good human is? But what I tell my students is say, look, we've been having this conversation for over 2,300 years in Western civilization and longer than that in other civilizations. And a lot of students would be surprised to discover that there's a fair amount of unanimity among the conclusions about what a good human is. So what I'm doing is saying, so what else must be true about reality to sort of explain this? This is the sort of obligation I feel like I have as a philosopher. We can't do it here, but I got accused, and I was sort of proud of being accused of this, when I gave a public talk on natural law theory, and a prominent apologist who was responding to what they heard me say indirectly through newspaper articles and stuff, said, well, the problem, because he didn't agree with my natural law theory, he said, well, the problem with Rinder's argument is it collapses into a cosmological argument. And I just went, yes, it does, ultimately. That is, I think as soon as we get out enough of these things like rationality, free will, existence, properties, Aristotle's 10 categories, however we want to do these kind of things, that in effect, you start arranging those pieces, it just is the classical Aristotelian Thomistic argument that demonstrates the existence of God. And then that begins to go, oh, now I see what I think is the ultimate, that what is instantiated when I achieve a human virtue is that virtue which was in me in potency becomes real. It becomes actual. Well, then goodness then is just actuality. Well, if God is infinite act, He's just infinite good. He's that which all things desire. Is another way you can define the good. And that's a lot of, maybe you opened up more.
Or you could say God said so.
Yes, or you could say that, but I don't say that.
You don't say that.
I don't say that out of the chute.
Right.
I do say that. I do think, because it wouldn't do any good if I'm arguing with someone who doesn't believe in God. I say it this way to my students. I'm trying to pick a non-controversial example of some moral atrocity. Let's say slavery. I suspect some Christians in the 19th century would have said, look, we don't have the luxury of time of waiting until every American becomes a Christian before we can begin to show them why slavery is immoral. There's got to be something that, by virtue of just being human, we can at least get a certain amount of morality, even if we can't get everything we need. And even if some things are fuzzy around the edges, there are some big issues like slavery that we can know are wrong. That's what I would say is a natural law.
Dr. Ruse, you appeared to be saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you're using the term illusion, it seemed to me you were using the term illusion the way one would use the term bias. That somebody has a bias for English cricket over over American baseball. Are you saying that the reason that Dr. Howe is coming to these conclusions because he has a pre-existing bias? He already believes in God, so he's trying to figure out a way to reverse engineer it so it winds up at God.
Yeah, bias has a bit of a negative connotation that that you give to one person rather than another. If I say, well, Richard is biased about this sort of thing, because, let's say, he's got a son who's an alcoholic, so he's, when we hear him on this, he's a bit biased, which to me introduces a sort of level of subjectivity that one person is being pushed at in a way that another isn't. Whereas when I use the word illusion, I want to say that this is something at some level that we all share. So I don't want, I'm certainly not...
Why would that be an illusion and not real?
When I say Richard is biased about this, I'm almost saying there's a weakness there. Now, if you want to say there's a general weakness, but I'm trying very hard not to use the term illusion in quite that sort of sense. So when I say that ethics is an illusion, and somebody says, Adam again says, I feel very strongly that my wife and I have a moral obligation to raise our children, our own children. It doesn't mean to say we don't have obligations to others, but we have special obligations. I don't see that as biased in the sense that this is a weakness that Adam's got that strong people like your president never had, as it were. That, well, poor Adam, he's younger, maybe he'll change. I don't see that. Whereas when I use the word illusion, what I want to say is that this is more a state that we're all in. And I'm not sure I want to say that this is necessarily a bad state. I want to say that this is what's going on. But as I say, to come back, apart from the fact that anybody who says I start with being, who says they're not a Cartesian, I don't know how you could say that. Cogito ergo sum, that's where we start. But it does seem to me now, Richard, that we are getting down to the nitty-gritty. And we are, believe it or not, even in a place like this, introducing God. That God is suddenly becoming part of our discussion and a fundamental...
Oh, yeah, I want that to happen. I'm not trying to be like a stinking...
I'm hearing more and more that you are, in fact, relying on natural theology, in which I, as a very conservative non-believer, would not. I mean, I follow Jesus. When Thomas said, why should I believe that you're the risen Christ? And Jesus said, well, look at them, friend, look at them, put your hand in. And then Jesus turns around and says, but blessed or better are those who believe without the evidence. That I think that Christianity is deeply committed to faith being all important. I mean, Aquinas agrees that we can get at it through reason, but it's never reason which has priority, or Pope John Paul II in Fides et Ratio. And so this is where we end up, you see. I just don't have faith. It's not that I, turn myself deliberately from it or anything like that. It just faded like stamp collecting. It just went. And that's where I'm at. And no proofs are going to work. Unless I have faith, I'm lost. And I don't have faith.
So, I'm almost more concerned about people leaving here thinking that I might be Cartesian than I might be immoral. I have to sort of...
Now, that's the mark of a true philosopher. That's the mark of a true philosopher.
So, no, Descartes doesn't start with being in the Thomistic sense. He starts with the cogito. I exist, not being. It's the very fact that he thinks he needs God.
Cogito ergo sum.
Yeah, but it's I. It's his own being. What I'm saying is the very fact that he thinks he needs God in his third step to exonerate his sensory experience is explicitly the opposite of what I would do to say, no, all of these things that you're thinking you're seeing, you actually really are seeing. That is my starting place. So the very thing that Descartes brings into question, which is his whole methodology, that he's going to systematic, is the very thing that I don't do. I do the 180-degree opposite of what Descartes does. Now, whether I'm right in doing that is a different issue. I'm just saying it's not Cartesian at all.
Speak to this issue, though. Dr. Ruse believes that Christianity is all about faith in the sense that you have no evidence, you just trust. Is that the Christian position?
Well, it's not the Thomist position. It may be some Christians' positions, perhaps. But I think this is an area where a lot of evangelicals muddy the waters because they frame faith as if it is something entirely absent evidence. Whereas, as I see it in the classical tradition, that the difference between faith and reason certainly in Aquinas, is that faith is believing something on the basis of a demonstration, whereas, reason is believing something on the basis of a demonstration, whereas faith is believing something on the basis of authority. So if you read, if you've seen the NOVA program, The Proof, where if you never thought that mathematics could be dramatically interesting, watch the NOVA program, I think it's on YouTube, The Proof. And it's all about Andrew Wiles proving Fermat's last theorem is true. It's one of the longest running enigmas in mathematics. And he finally proved it to be true in 1997 or 8. And the thing is, his proof is 111 pages in the Annals of Mathematics. Now, Andrew Wiles and his associates at Cambridge and other universities understood the proof, and so they believed that Fermat's last theorem was true by demonstration. I read or I hear a NOVA program, and somebody said, well, Richard, do you believe that Fermat's last theorem is... I just like saying Fermat. Do you believe Fermat's last theorem is true? I would say yes. Well, have you read the proof? Well, no. Well, why do you believe it's true? Because I believe Andrew Wiles. Here's the thing, though. I'm not a fool in believing in Andrew Wiles. He's a bona fide mathematician corroborated by his fellow mathematicians. If I just believe some Yahoo and Esquire magazine or Inquirer magazine or whatever, then maybe that would be foolish. But reason is able to help me adjudicate authorities so that when Andrew Wiles tells me something about mathematics, I can trust that he's true, even though I don't and can't understand the demonstration. So as a Christian, I would say there are things that are true about reality that I trust what I believe to be God has told me through His Word, the Bible. Now, we could have a discussion whether there's a God. We could have a discussion whether the Bible is... Those are legitimate. But pending those conversations, if I'm believing something to be true, like, for example, Jesus died on the cross, and I asked a friend of mine who we were supposed to be going out sharing the gospel, and they said, okay, well, we're practicing on each other. I said, you go first, you share the gospel with me. She started to tell me, well, Jesus died for our sins. I said, well, I have a question for you. 3 people died that day. What makes his death different from the other 2? She said, I don't know. I said, well, that's what we really need to be talking about, because somebody's probably going to ask you that. And I would argue, look, 3 people died on Calvary, but I believe Jesus' death pays for my sins. But how do I know that? I know it because I believe God told me that that's the case through His Word. So I'm trusting Him about it. In fact, that's what the Christian would say is salvation, is trusting in this case, God, who tells you that if you trust in what I did for you on the cross, then I'll impute my righteousness to you and you can go to heaven when you die. Now, can I demonstrate that His death paid for my sins in exactly the way that I can demonstrate that He died historically? Well, no. So that's what faith is, not bereft of reason altogether. It's just at that moment, I make this decision to trust what, rightly or wrongly, I've concluded is an authority on this issue, whether it's Andrew Wiles in mathematics or God in terms of the crucifixion of Jesus. That's how I see the distinction. So what I take, if I followed you correctly, to be faith, I think is in some circumstances can be ill-advised. And even what I do may be ill-advised in some respects. People can adjudicate their authorities wrong. I mean, I realize there are lots of questions to answer, but that to me is the principal difference of what's going on.
Before we go to questions, how would you define faith, Dr. Ruse?
I suppose in the Christian context, I would describe it as a gift of God that He reaches out to us and envelops us with a sense of His being, His importance, our humbleness before Him. I don't believe in substitutionary atonement, but I certainly believe that faith recognizes that you are a creature of God rather than God a creature of you. I think those sorts of, I'm certainly not trying to put, a definition that would not be acceptable when I read of somebody like C.S. Lewis, for instance, who took a long time. But at some level, finally, as he says in his autobiography, I got down on my knees and accepted God as my Savior, my Creator, my Savior. I certainly do not see faith as a matter of reason. I do see faith as not opposed to reason, but a different sort of thing. I'm uncomfortable with the word authority because, of course, the Catholic Church would say that you believe certain things on authority because, like the assumption of the Virgin. Because I don't think faith requires other people to have told you what you do. Maybe that is a function of my Quaker background. That ultimately it's for each and every one of us to make this thing. And there's no question that some people have felt that some external force has reached out to them. John Heck, for instance, and obviously C.S. Lewis is another, who felt that it wasn't their doing. It was something which came to them from without. And I'd be perfectly honest, at the age of 20, I was just as susceptible as anybody else. And we all know what it's like to be bound up in emotion. We've all fallen in love. And, you recognize that it's not necessarily the most rational thing you've ever done. Why in God's name am I entangling myself with a 19-year-old sort of thing? Reason tells me this is the most stupid thing that I've ever done. 36 years later, I'm still doing what I'm told. Yeah, right, you know what I'm talking about. So I see faith as being that, as opposed to reason, evidence, and reason, where you sit down and you prove not only that the earth is round and other things like that, but that God exists, and if you take seriously, say, the teleological argument that God is good, all-powerful, ontological argument, God is outside time and space. In other words, you're able to offer. It's certainly the Platonic definition of God. I'm not sure you're able to offer the notion of God as a person, the biblical version of God. But so that's what I see as natural theology. I don't dismiss it as stupid. I do dismiss it, I think, increasingly as misconceived.
From your perspective, is it possible that as someone like Dr. Howe is trying to reverse engineer from this perception of an objective moral law, is it possible that he, reasoning from effect to cause, has arrived at God legitimately?
Well, I think he's arrived at God. Legitimately, I don't think he's cheating in the sense of, legitimately would be plagiarizing or, that sort of thing. So, yes, obviously, I don't want to impute dishonesty to my fellow debater. I do want to impute, what should we say, inadequacy, if I'm going to be, totally blunt about it, because obviously I think that somebody who draws wrong conclusions, and we've all done it, has been inadequate. But that's another matter at some sort of level. But, even with faith, falling in love. I've certainly, in my time, fallen in love with some very unsuitable human beings.
Adam, can we set up the microphone? And as you're doing that, I want to keep the conversation going. Richard, do you want to respond to anything Dr. said here?
Well, I don't know. I can't.
Can we do one thing maybe before, because we did leave this on the table?
I will say this, just to...
Okay, just in my defense again.
No, I might just go on.
For that reason.
Sorry. Too much lettuce for lunch.
Sorry.
I appreciate, he could do no other than to conclude that I must be inadequate, as we've all found ourselves to be. Otherwise, he would have to admit the truth of my conclusions. I'd have to say the same thing. If somebody pressed me and go, well, do I think Dr. Ruse has come to his conclusions legitimately? I would say I think he's come to them honestly. And I don't want to sound like, because I haven't made enough out of it, that I somehow don't agree with this idea that there's more going on in this equation than just merely what we can muster by philosophical acumen. I do believe in religious experience. I do believe as a Christian that we're only able to sort of cross the finish line of faith by a supernatural act of the Holy Spirit. I do believe that that's true. But those are more theological considerations than they might be philosophical ones, like relevant to tonight. But I will say this in my defense, and this may or may not apply to Dr. Ruse.
Defend yourself.
Well, you decide. You decide whether that's the case after I say what I'm going to say. In my experience, there is just an abject ignorance among contemporary philosophers who weigh in on philosophy of religion issues. There's an abject ignorance about the classical doctrines of classical theism. the tradition from Aristotle, and it reaches its zenith in Aquinas. And so when I read I teach a course on contemporary atheism. We talk about popular atheism, like say a George Smith or John Loftus or Dan Barker or whomever. We talk about the new atheism that I know Dr. Ruse has a certain level of contempt for, understandably, and I agree with him, for the new atheists like the Richard Dawkins or these, but also the academic atheists, the J.L. Mackie, the Michael Martin. And what I discovered in teaching that class, this doesn't make the tradition right, but I'm just saying these guys almost never interact with Aquinas' argument for God's existence. I do a presentation contrasting Aquinas and Paley on the design argument, the watchmaker. And here's why Aquinas' argument is not at all Paley's argument. You would be stunned to see how many philosophers talk about Paley as a continuation of the teleological argument from Aquinas. And so as a Thomist, just go, the very fact that you think this is an installation of the same argument proves you have no idea what Aquinas is even talking about in his arguments for God's existence. Now, you may go on to discover what he's talking about and still reject them, fine. But I find almost no literature, or I should say, I find almost no contemporary philosopher of religion that seems to really be interacting with this classical tradition. So that's what at one level, what may look like as a sort of I'm dropping the ball that I could make this conclusion, just be aware whether I'm right or wrong, ultimately you'll have to decide. But what I'm asserting is the cumulative effect of trafficking in this classical tradition that never gets really responded to adequately. Anyway, that was more than you wanted to know.
Well, as you have said before, reading Aquinas is like trying to gargle peanut butter. It is difficult.
Chunky peanut butter.
Yes. All right, let's go to questions, and we're going to have a period at the very end for closing statements from both of them. So we'll do the questions first. And these are going to be questions, not speeches. Okay? So we have a microphone here. We need to come to the microphone. Just come right up to the microphone. You can line up behind.
I was going to go to the microphone and ask them a question.
Yes, sir. Who's your question for?
Here. I'm a chaplain, a Christian chaplain, and I was raised here by a mother who loved animals. And in America, we love our animals, and we know that if we treat our animals wrong, that you pay consequences for it. And you talked about, Dr. Rue, about parents have a moral obligation in raising their kids. So my parents raised us to love animals. But when I was out of high school, I went to the military, and I moved to Korea for 2 years. And in Korea, they eat dog. And that really struck me as like, man, is this moral? Is this immoral? But yet, based on your comments earlier, how as evolution, how we've evolved, and morality is kind of there as we evolve. I guess my question would be for both of you. In America, it's wrong. It's illegal. They would put me on social media and plaster me over and say that is immoral. But yet, when I was in Korea, it's perfectly moral. It's perfectly okay. So is that something that's subjective? Is that something that's evolved? Or is that just, it's okay there and it's not okay here? So simply, is it good or is it bad?
Well, I was driving along with my daughter once, and we saw a big sign put up by the vegetarians, a picture of a dog and a picture of a pig. And it said, "Why do we eat pigs and not dogs?" And my daughter's response after a summer in Vietnam was that pigs taste a hell of a lot better. I mean, that is a very good question. I would be inclined to say that it's something we didn't really get into here, not because it wasn't important, but because we were talking at other levels. I would say it's obviously a question of morality, but I think it's also very much a question of empirical fact or empirical beliefs about the status of other animals, other animals than us. And if, for instance, I think most of us would feel very uncomfortable about eating, let's say, chimpanzees. I suspect they would in Korea too. Why? Because, well, we've got an understanding of chimpanzees where at some level we identify them with humans or human-like. Now, you and I, we've got 6 dogs, so we're into it. I mean, for the Ruses, the older Ruses anyhow, eating dogs is, you know, I'd sooner eat my headmaster who I didn't think was human anyway. You know what I mean? So, no, as I say, I think it's a tricky question. I think it's one which would be worth having a semester seminar on. But I would be inclined to say it's not going to be the issues which are separating Richard and myself at this time, because we both want to say there are absolute moral standards about how one ought to behave, but it's so much a question of what are the particular facts which come into it. I mean, it's like, for instance, both of us would say bombing civilians is wrong. However, what if you put civilians all around the ball-bearing factory, which is, you know, causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of others in the tanks and that sort of thing? And those are things which we're not differing about morality. We're differing about consequences and those sort of things. So I'd be inclined to say the same with dogs. Clearly, for better or for worse, we in America, and God knows I'm English, feel that dogs have a certain status which pigs don't have.
From an evolutionary
It's an important question.
From an evolutionary perspective, Dr. Ruse, why would it be wrong to eat dogs?
Why would we not? From an evolutionary perspective, I don't see why we wouldn't eat dogs, but I don't do everything on an evolutionary perspective. I think evolution put us where we are, but it doesn't mean to say that evolution now necessarily, I mean, I can see fighting going on, let's say, as natural, let's say, between dogs and cats. Doesn't mean to say I shouldn't separate them or something like that.
Well, it is an interesting question. I'm actually on the committee of a dissertation where the student is writing on this issue, so the jury's still out with me about the threshold of animal rights and these kind of things. I had been to the country of South Africa 5 times, and I talked with a friend of mine at church who had been to the country, and he asked me, because we love game viewing down there, my wife and I have been to the Kruger, and he said, "What is your favorite animal in South Africa?" I said, "The chicken." He said, "It's delicious." That ended up being my favorite animal. But yeah, on some of these, I mean, I think there might be ways in which certain moral principles might come into play in a way that reminds us of certain things that we celebrate morally between other human beings. But I couldn't speak to that yet until I read this dissertation.
Horses is another thing. When I was in France, the horse butcher came to the market every Thursday, whereas you know in America, you're not allowed to kill horses for food. And, you know, the knackered horses get shipped down to Mexico. Whether they'll be able to do so when the wall's in place is another matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It would seem that if morality wasn't objective in some sense, and I'll just throw this over real quickly, it wouldn't be any kind of dilemma or issue to even discuss the matter.
Well, but see, the trouble I'm having is still this distinction between something being objective and real and illusory with respect to morality. And I don't think that the illustration of the person's affections for their own home team, even though I would agree, that doesn't pick out anything real about the home team. It does pick out something real about the person's psychology. And I think it's important not to miss, unless I've misunderstood, that Professor Ruse's position is that the morality that we are experiencing is something evolution has inculcated into us. What it's picking out is something about our psychology, not something about the thing about which we feel the morality. It's not picking anything else real outside of just our own psychology. I think, unless I've misunderstood, that doesn't need to be missed, that's what your position is. Whereas my position is there's something real about things that morality is picking out. And it ultimately has to do with being or existence, of which God is existence itself.
Anything to add to that?
Well, I think let's go on.
Okay. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Dr. Ruse, one thing we didn't get the opportunity to hear, and I think it probably would have played importantly into the conversation, was the distinction you make between materialism and naturalism. And you mentioned the name Alvin Plantinga. He obviously has a very prevalent argument how that undermines the evolutionary mindset, and I'd like to hear, depending on what your distinction is, what you would say to Plantinga's argument against that.
Well, first of all, let me congratulate you on your beard. I've been trying for 60 years to grow something like that. If it means being bald as a coot like you, as a trade-off, I'm not sure.
Hey, wait a minute.
I think that what I want to say was this. I take materialism to be, dare one say, Cartesian res extensa, that there is nothing but material objects. And I take it that somebody like Dan Dennett, who thinks that the mind is nothing but a machine, is a materialist in that sense. So there really are materialists, have been materialists. I'm not that kind. First of all, I'm not sure that I think quantum mechanics and these things throws a great deal of doubt on issues like, is it all just a massy thing like the Greek atomists thought? Certainly something like quantum entanglement leads me to think there's more to that. But I think human beings, I don't, obviously Descartes, we're agreed on this, I think Descartes was wrong in his dualism to make us, res cogitans versus res extensa, because you just can't join them when you've done that. So at some level, I'm certainly a monist. Now, whether that means I'm a panpsychist, meaning thinking that everything has mind at some level, or whether I think that mind is maybe, some kind of emergent theorist, I'm not very keen on that, who thinks that once you put together the molecules in a certain way, something different emerges from that. I'm not terribly keen on that myself, but that's certainly why I'm more comfortable about calling myself a naturalist, in the sense of everything working according to unbroken law without rhyme or reason. I take it that I would want to say that all scientists, inasmuch as they're scientists, are, to use the terminology which is used, are methodological naturalists. I don't think, like Philip Johnson believes, that being a methodological naturalist means that automatically you're going to be a metaphysical naturalist, because I just don't think that's true. I mean, somebody like George Ellis, for instance, the South African physicist, is clearly not a metaphysical naturalist, although he's clearly a methodological naturalist. So I don't think the two follow. I guess I'm a metaphysical naturalist as long as it's understood. I'm an agnostic metaphysical naturalist, not an atheistic metaphysical naturalist.
Anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So the question, I'm going to phrase something that you said, but the question's really for both of you. You had mentioned a few times that morality is real, and I don't think that anyone here is really arguing that, because we can all see that morality is real. We all live by it. But you mentioned a few things that are objectively wrong, like bombing people or having sexual relations with little girls and things like that. But you didn't say why those are objectively wrong. You just said that they...
Oh, yes, I think I did. I think I did at the beginning of the evening. Or at least I tried to, with my example of the dullest form of morality, that I think that if there is an objective morality, then I think it's almost pretty much built into the notion of what we mean by objective morality, is that humans would be aware of it. I don't mean all humans. I'm quite happy to accept psychopaths. I mean, I'm not happy to accept them, but I accept the existence of them, in that sense, who I don't. But I think an objective morality, I don't know what it would mean to say there is an objective morality, but we live in total ignorance of it. But my problem is, I think that morality at that sort of level, thanks to evolution, we could live in total ignorance, because evolution goes different ways. I mean, Darwin talks about this. If we evolved in ant-like ways, women would think that when winter comes, like last weekend, it's their bounden duty to kick the males out of the house and close the door firmly. And they wouldn't just do it. They'd think morally they should do that. So I think that we could have evolved in different sorts of ways where we could have moral standards. Maybe they do on Andromeda. And that you could go through life believing, like we do, that you should look after your small children, whereas maybe another morality would say, well, you should look after our small children until you've got 4 or 5, at which point you should start eating them. A bit like birds. Kick them out of the nest because you can't deal with that many or neglect them. And I think we would think that that was wrong, but I could imagine a sophisticated race of humanoids that might think that.
So, if I may, you're talking about another reality might exist, but can we talk about the one that we know exists right now? And because I still don't really understand exactly why bombing humans or raping little girls is wrong. You say that we can have a different morality.
No, I do know why it's wrong. It's because there is at some level. At some level, I think it's an absolute. It is wrong, I can say why we think it's wrong, but at some level, it's something which I accept as true. I mean, why are there, I can give you a genetic reason, for instance, about why there are 3 males on this podium rather than some women or something like that. I could argue, I could make the point that if we were at a more liberal arts college, it wouldn't have happened, but because we're at a seminary which has certain views about the orderings of males and females, that's why. I can give you that sort of thing. But ultimately, we 3 men from Orient are sort of thing. Here we are, and there's no argument. We just are. And so I think it's the same. Killing, looking at having duties to small children, your own small children, is just a moral absolute in that sense. But again, this goes back to the debate we've been having all evening. I want to be able to use absolutes or objective in the baseball sense, whereas I think my opponent, I don't want to call him an opponent because I don't feel him as an opponent. I think of him as a fellow seeker. I really mean that. Even though he says nasty things about Descartes. But I don't think of it as so we differ on that, but we don't differ on those sort of absolutes like that. The question is, how do you justify the absolute? And I want to say, ultimately, there is no justification where whatever he says about God, I think he says ultimately that's because the big fellow in the sky said this is what you want to do.
Well, I think I recognize the Dulles model as mutually assured destruction. I don't know if they used that term during the 50s, but that's how I recognize it. The question has come up in some debates about human flourishing. So some atheists would try to leverage arguments against things like child molestation or rape or whatever in terms of how it detracts from human flourishing. And I got in trouble in some small circles and ponds because I thought there was a sense in which that was true, that there is a robust sense in which human morality really does, all things being equal, lead to human flourishing. Where I think the question goes from there is, human flourishing, I think, can only be unpacked once a person begins to understand what it is to be a human and human nature, which is, by the way, a metaphysical category. Unless it's just a shorthand for what we call a collection of things, I think there's something real in terms of which we are human beings. And I think that this human flourishing is the result of human beings actualizing potentials as a community that arise out of what it is to be human. But I think that telos, that aiming towards that telos is a realization of a good, because what it's aiming for is something that God has created. There wouldn't be human beings if per impossible wasn't a God, because he just is he just is by his very essence what it is that we are participating in as human beings when we experience the good of human flourishing, the being of human flourishing. We're gaining actuality as we experience more and more of what it is to be human. But we only participate, to use a Platonic term, in existence. Aquinas would say, but the only reason why things that aren't existing because of their very nature, it's not part of my nature as a human to exist. The only reason I can exist is I'm being caused to exist by something that just is existence. Is substantial existence. And I would argue, as the cosmological argument would do, there has to be this thing if anything is existing. So, to me, I wrote a paper when I was, like, my first year of graduate school in philosophy on why should we be moral? And I tried in a very crude way that graduate students can sometimes do to hook up the idea of being moral and the idea of something being good for you. I think this classical tradition absolutely pushes that all the way to the finish to say, how is it that what I recognize as morally good is just in effect what is good for me. And I think this classical tradition is what, again, pushes it all the way, because it's the actualization of the perfection of existence itself, of which God is infinite. Now, it must be said, however, while I think the obligatory nature of morality arises from divine commands, the content of morality doesn't arise from divine commands. So that's where I think the breakdown is with the divine command theory. So what morality has to do with what good is. But what ultimately, if you go to my website and read an article I didn't write, but just go to richardghowe.com and follow the links to resources and papers, scroll down and find the paper, The Convertibility of Being and Good in Thomas Aquinas. Ooh, that's something I want to curl up with tonight. You know, we were going to go out to eat. Are you kidding? I'm going home to read Convertibility of Being and Good. That, I think, summarizes the Thomas position because unless you hook up what is good and what is, you know, the naturalistic fallacy or the is-off accusation says, well, you can't get an is from an ought. Well, I mean, you can't get an ought from an is. Well, you're going to get an ought from an is not? Of course you get it from an is. That's the only place you can get an ought is from an is.
So Richard, just to be clear, then we got to move to the next.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't be clear.
No. Just I want to understand this, and if Dr. Ruse wants to jump in for a second, that's fine too. But you're saying that there is then still a place for a divine command, because why are human beings under an obligation to actualize their potential?
Well,
to flourish human beings.
Aquinas says this. Here's the Latin: bonum est faciendum et prosequendum et malum vitandum.
Of course, I got it.
No, I wanted to throw that in because that'll be the clip that'll survive YouTube.
All right.
Forget about the debate. Listen to this guy's Latin. It's unbelievable. There has to be a God. For Aquinas, this is the first principle of the practical intellect. Practical intellect would be that aspect of you that seeks to produce actions.
Okay, we got to go quickly here.
So, in translation it is, the good is to be done and pursued, and evil to be avoided. It is a first principle, just like the law of non-contradiction. So to ask somebody, why should I be moral, is like asking them, why should I believe what's true? Because your intellect is the kind of thing that aims to the true. It aims to exist. When your intellect grabs what is real, we call that true. When your intellect grabs what is good, or grabs reality, we call that good. So as the intellect grabs the real, we call it true. As the will grabs the real, we call that good.
You want to push back on any of this?
No, I don't think so. We've got 4 more speakers.
Let's keep going. Thank you. Go ahead. These are the last 4. We've got to go quickly.
No, we don't.
All right. I think he answered his side of this same question, but in your opening statement, you were talking about morality coming from evolution as psychology. Am I understanding that correctly? But you also mentioned an enforcer, that if there's a morality, there's also an enforcer, but I didn't get what that is.
What I'm saying is, if morality were, as a school of philosophy known as the emotivists said, morality was no more than emotions, then I think it would break down. I mean, poor Adam, he's going to have a bonus. The president's left already. You know, I think the teasing I've made of him about the letters. But I think morality is more than just I like lettuce or I don't like lettuce. What did the late President Bush say? He couldn't stand broccoli. You know, all his life he's hated broccoli, and now he's president, he doesn't have to eat broccoli anymore. I think if morality were no more than that, then I think it would be open to cheating. I mean, morality is open to cheating. There are people who claim to do one thing who do other things. We know that. But by and large, morality keeps us social, because morality is more than just the two of us. Morality is something laid on us, as it were, objectively. And that's the whole phenomenological experience of morality. Whereas if morality were, well, if you want to help these kids or not, well, do so, but, you know, it's really your choice. Some people don't like to help kids, and that's their choice. And I think if morality were just that, then I think you know, the whole point that sociality would break down because people would feel no obligations, no force to help others, and all they want to do is grab whatever they can get. I think morality is, if you like, I use the word enforcer, a policeman in some sense, to say, no, you should behave that way. It doesn't mean to say that people will always be moral. Even Dr. Gleister, I suspect, has returned at least one library book in his life too late. And he's known that he's doing that. He's known that he's doing that. You know? So it is that we're always moral. But I think morality is something which has to have that phenomenological character of objectivity to do its job.
Okay. Anything to add? No, let's keep going. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sherwood. I'm a scientist. I'm a chemist, and I grew up in my parents are both naturalists, and grew up being a very strong evolution believer and naturalist myself. And I finally rejected the idea, and the reason I did, and this is my question to you, is I couldn't explain why should if I am just a summation of random processes, why should I do anything at all, and why should I live? There was a part of me that was saying that I want to live, but I don't know from a naturalistic standpoint, why live, I guess, because, you know, you cease to exist at death. Your family does too. You can't take your money with you. You know, all your appreciation goes out the door. So what's the point if we all just cease to exist?
What's the purpose of life?
Yeah, it's an easy question.
2 minutes, go. If you want to put this in the overall thing, I have no answer to you there. But if you want to put it in an individual basis, or we are here, and life can be fun. I mean, you don't look like a young man who spent his whole life sort of agonizing about the rights or wrongs, whether you've got a girlfriend or dare I say, possibly a boyfriend. But, but you've had success at your work, you've had disappointments, you've had parents that you negotiate, you've got a job. I mean, it's worthwhile. It's something. So why kill yourself before it ends? I mean, sure, if at some point you got incurable cancer and it was very painful and the doctor said, I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do to stop the pain. You've got 5 years of total agony. I suspect some people in this room would say, well, that's too bad. I'm not sure. I'd probably say, well, maybe you should go to Oregon and finish it all. So I think those are questions, but that's not quite the question you asked. So all I can say is I think it's worthwhile making meaning out of your life here. And I hate to say this, but I think the three people up here, all three of us, would agree to that. And clearly, we're people who haven't always been successful, though from my conversations with them, they are people who found meaning in their lives and things being worthwhile and all of that.
What's the purpose of life? 30 seconds.
Well, I mean, it's going to ultimately, I think, find its solution in God, who is infinite goodness, infinite beauty, infinite truth. It's all of those things. And I think it's our destiny as human beings to have the option to choose to spend all of eternity basking in total satisfaction and bliss in communion with our Maker. I think that's the reason why there's life. While there's human life, and that's our telos. I think it can't be achieved by natural means. I agree with Aquinas that this is something that's not, quote unquote, natural to us. It's supernatural to us.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Dave Peterson, and this question is for Dr. Ruse. In seminary, used a book called God and Morality, 4 Views, and in here you presented the view called Naturalist Moral Non-Realism. And one line I just wanted to get your input on. You wrote, so how then do I justify my substantive ethical beliefs? I claim simply there is no justification. I think the substantive ethics claims like love your neighbor as yourself are simply psychological beliefs put in place by natural selection in order to maintain and improve our reproductive fitness. My question on that is, how is that in an objective sense?
Well, it's been what I've been arguing all evening, because it's exactly what I've been saying. I think that morality at some level is a set of psychological beliefs that have been put in place by natural selection. As I've said, I think they're different sorts of beliefs from liking candy or liking lettuce or not liking lettuce. What I want to say is, within the system, I think, Americans could have played completely, you might have played, lacrosse might have been your native game, as it were, rather than baseball, America's game. And then you'd have had something quite different. But you've got baseball, and within the system, I think, a historian of sports could probably tell you about the history of baseball, why it was so important in America, and why, for instance, America plays baseball rather than cricket, whereas Jamaica plays cricket rather than baseball. But within the system, I think you've got objectivity, and that's what I've been saying all evening.
I only wish you'd use the Carolina Panthers as your metaphor rather than a baseball metaphor, but anyway.
Thank you very much.
Has anybody ever told you you look like Luke Skywalker?
Yeah.
I think it's Mark Hamill. Have you heard that? Yeah, that's right. You do look like Mark Hamill. In fact, I'm going to tell people you were Mark Hamill. Yes, sir. He came just to hear us talk.
My name is Josh, and the question is for Dr. Ruse. Dr. Ruse, the question is on abortion. I don't know whether you think abortion is wrong or whether it's right, but you have stated that parents have a moral absolute duty to take care of their children, but you've also stated that you're an evolutionist. And if that's true, then we're no different than dogs, cats, hyenas, and we therefore have no moral obligation. So it seems like a contradiction.
Well, again, this goes back to when we were talking about dogs, and I don't mean to imply, some trivial sense that humans are just dogs. But I think it's not a question of whether or not one has moral obligations to other human beings, but whether or not one wants to count the fetus as being a human being. And I would want to say, dare I say it, with people like Aquinas, that I don't see, let's say, a 3-week-old fetus as a fully functioning human being. I mean, I just simply don't. My wife and I, we had 2 abortions, and yet neither of us have felt any psychological worries about that. We both thought that this was a good thing. The first one, my wife had been taking drugs because we were going to South Africa, and nobody could tell us whether these would affect the fetus or not. And we just decided that we were going to play safe on that. Within a year, we'd had a perfectly healthy baby. So, we don't feel any psychological thing there, because we don't think about, even if we took the Bible seriously, I'm not sure there's biblical evidence to support abortion. But certainly, I don't think that there's philosophical or biological evidence to support the personhood. Now, does that mean I'm okay with abortions at 30 weeks old? No, of course it doesn't. Does that mean I'm okay with abortions at 20 weeks old? Well, I certainly prefer not. But if, for instance, you discovered that the kid had got Huntington's chorea, I wouldn't say that somebody who had an abortion at that age would be morally wrong. But, like every normal person, I would prefer to have universal birth control so we didn't get into these issues. I think it's better to have efficient birth control than to do it through abortions.
So where would you draw the line and why?
With what?
Where would you draw the line and why?
Well, because I don't think that there's a strict line. If you go from blue to red, when is it still blue? When is it still red? I know what blue is. I know what red is. And there's an arguable thing. As I say, normally I would probably say to draw the line at 10, 12 weeks. But as I say,
why?
Because by that stage, I think that you're starting, as I say, I think it's a fuzzy area. But I would say a fetus of 34 weeks is clearly a human being, is clearly blue. A fetus of 2 weeks is clearly not a human being, it's clearly red. But there's going to be areas in the middle. And as I say, I would normally want to draw, I would say, well, why didn't you have an abortion earlier? Oh, well, I couldn't make my mind up. I don't think that's a good enough reason. On the other hand, Huntington's chorea strikes me as a very good reason.
Well,
as I say, I don't think that this is a question of morality. I think this is more a question of how you define a human being.
Yeah, no, I don't really have much. I mean, we don't need to debate abortion, but I would suggest before we revert to universal birth control, we try to try some abstinence, promulgate some kind of cultural value about not having sex until you get married. But that's another debate.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My name is Mike McFerrin. I'd like to direct a question to you, Dr. Ruse, and then
Oh, Michael Ruse. He's getting bashed right, left, and center tonight.
Welcome to my club.
Yeah, right.
I'm a businessman. I have no idea half the people you're talking about. The only sponsor I know is probably Richard, right? But, so I get Richard's premise on the debate that you're having is God required for morality? It sounds like you both agree on morality. I'm going to ask this question because I want to try to understand where you're coming from. And it seems to me the only real issue is who decides or how it's decided. And what I understand is he's doing it based on the authority of whatever he is assigned to, God, the Bible, etc. And you have a lot of confidence in evolution. And so my question is, in business, we would say most people would consider that to be Darwinian, right? Or evolution-like, which I don't know that I would agree with. But the hard part I have is in business, we would talk about best practices. That's the best practice in existence today. But with evolution or in business, today's best practice is tomorrow's extinct species. And so where I struggle is I'm trying to understand how do you have so much confidence in evolution when you know that, logically speaking, and you're both very logical, how do I know that today's conclusion, based on my evolution position today, well, by definition, it seems to be it's going to be obsolete. We can debate the time frame, but it starts becoming obsolete tomorrow. So where it's authority here, evolution here, I'm trying to understand how you have so much confidence in that based on the natural.
But isn't this the human dilemma? That we, at some level, we do have this pragmatic element built in. We talked a bit about slavery. Aristotle, that both of us admire immensely, made an argument in favor of slavery. Now, why was that? Well, obviously, in part, it was because he didn't know enough about human beings. I think one of the big arguments that I would bring against slavery or against the Nazis and Jews is that they're making a mistaken assumption about the nature of blacks or about the nature of captives or about the nature of Jews. That it is not the case that Jews are inherently avaricious or whatever it might be, or that blacks are inherently inferior or intellectually inferior or questions like that. So, as I say, I see these things going on. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it could be that, let's say, a couple of hundred years from now, we look back and say, we really were mistaken about natural selection. Now, molecular evidence shows that adaptation is nothing like as powerful. I mean, there are already people like Stephen Jay Gould who said just that. So, I'm perfectly prepared to be overthrown by a naturalistic argument. And that, of course, is where the two of us basically, have been differing. Because I want to say my position is vulnerable from naturalistic points of view, whereas Richard, let's say my sparring partner, wants to say, no, I can undercut your position from a philosophical point of view, metaphysically. And that's what I'm not prepared to grant.
Well, and just for the record, I would qualify your characterization of my view. It isn't merely that my view on morality is an issue of authority. It's ultimately that, but it's not merely that. So in the same way, or in an analogous way, where could people do physics without considering God? I would say absolutely. There are all kinds of physicists that may be as good or better than any given theist physicist, because there's something objective and independent about the nature of the physical world that allows us as rational creatures to learn a lot of things about it. However, I think, as the cosmological argument would try to show, you can't ultimately account for that very physical world without this particular accounting that God gives to the argument and stuff. So there's an analogy there to morality. And so I think people, by virtue of just being human, can engage to a robust sense a certain level of morality. But ultimately, they can't account for it as atheists. That would be my position. That would be the natural law tradition position as I understand it.
So then my follow-up question then would be, and again, business manufacturing, right? We make parts, they're good parts or bad parts, based on whether or not we did them right or wrong. So how do I know what right looks like if I'm telling people, well, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, and I know evolution-wise it's going to be better tomorrow, which means today was bad. So who tells me what right looks like? My question to both of you is.
Well, I mean, I think, just as I tried to say about the word good, to say what a good widget is depends on what a widget ought to be by virtue of being a widget, or a knife, or a pizza, or a human being. So the word good has some kind of connection with what a thing is by its nature, which why I don't really like artificial things like knives. They illustrate the point, but there really isn't a nature of a knife, I don't think. But there is of something like a human. So that's approximately what we mean by good when we talk about a good human being. It's something that is fairly, not unanimous, but is fairly uniform throughout all the world's religions and all the philosophies, from Confucius to Aristotle, about what a good human being is. So that's how you would know. Well, a good human being is somebody that has the virtues, what is known from the Greeks as the virtues of fidelity and responsibility and industry and these kinds of things. But I think that only carries you so far, but at least it can, in principle, carry you far enough to have a peaceful coexistence. So that I think this is a way, by the way, God superintends nations in the world and peoples within nations is this common sense of human flourishing. But I think philosophically, though, it's hanging in midair until it finds its connection with ultimate being, which is God. So it's not so much that God is dictating, although he does dictate certain things that I think that human reason can't deliver. So natural law can tell us that infidelity in a marriage might be immoral, but natural law doesn't tell you that lusting is immoral. Jesus tells us, well, you heard you shouldn't murder, but I say if you hate someone without a cause, you've already... I go, well, wait a minute, this is a lot thicker than I thought it was. And so I see a role, that indispensable role that special revelation plays for a life of righteousness before God.
All right, Dr. Ruse went first with his opening statement, so let's just take about 2 minutes each for closing, wrap this up. Why can't there be good without God?
The short answer is because there can't be anything without God, if by God I mean substantial existence itself, some being whose very nature is existence. If that doesn't exist, there wouldn't be existence of anything. Now, per impossible, if there was no God, there couldn't be morality. But the question, I think, is asking something a little bit more practical. And I think there can be morality as a level of practice among people, even if they're not theists or even Christian theists. And it's exactly what the natural law tradition argues for. It's the way in which God has given us to peacefully coexist so that I could talk to my fellow American and lobby for some kind of civil rights legislation or pro-life legislation, whatever I can do. I can do that, at least in principle, on the basis of sound reason, irrespective of whether they agree with me about God's existence. So at one level, you don't need God in order to have morality to a certain extent. On the other level, you couldn't even have anything, including morality, unless there's a God.
Thank you. Dr. Ruse.
Well, I think Dr. Howe has basically laid out my position too, except I wouldn't accept the first half of what he said, in the sense that I want to say, yes, obviously we can have morality without God, but the point is that enough? Do we metaphysically at some level have to have God to support it? And I think this is where we do differ, is that he wants to say, yes, the whole thing is kind of collapses in, it's meaningless without the belief in a necessary creative being. And I want to say, well, I don't know whether there is one or there isn't one, so clearly my position has to be that such a being is not necessary, that one can have this without such a being. But as I've said, and let me bring this together in a note of harmony. This is why I'm not a new atheist in the sense of thinking that Christianity and evolution, or that atheism, science proves atheism, that evolution proves atheism, as I think somebody like Richard Dawkins, certainly Jerry Coyne, would argue, because I want to say that if, in fact, one did become a Christian, I don't think my position on ethics would be changed one little bit in the sense of the position I've got. All I want to say is that this was all created by God. At the moment, I don't know whether it was or it wasn't. So God can't function in my overall position. But as I say, I don't see any reason why a Christian shouldn't accept everything that I accept, as I'm beginning to think Richard does accept, but wants to go that metaphysical step further. A very big step. I'm not just simply saying it's just one little item. It's a very big step. But as I say, funnily enough, at the end of the evening, I see a lot more harmony than I see disagreement.
I see a lot more harmony from this gentleman than I've ever seen in any debate of any Christian and atheist before. I just want to thank you for your wonderful... I have a new favorite atheist. I did. I had the opportunity to be an agnostic atheist. And Richard.
Now, since Richard is not, Adam is not going to drive me back because I've said someone can move things. Which way do I start walking?
Frank will take it.
All right. You have to close this, Adam?
Yes, please. Let's give one more round of applause for our